You are now watching the 84th Annual NAACP New York State Conference Convention. The United States is home to the world's largest prison population. As tough-on-crime laws have put an unprecedented number of nonviolent offenders behind bars in recent years, our neighborhoods still don't feel safe. Our branches of the New York State NAACP pursue police accountability on their treatment of African American citizens. Here is Dr. Divine Pryor, President and CEO of the People's Police Academy at Medgar Evers College, to kick off our criminal justice discussion.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Divine Pryor, and I'm the President and CEO of the People's Police Academy at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York. I first want to thank Dr. Hazel Dukes for giving me an opportunity to come before you today to their 2020 New York State Conference to speak a little bit about police accountability. This is a subject I know very well. As a young man who was fascinated with books and fascinated with science, realizing that my intellectual development was happening much faster than my social development could handle, found myself in a quandary. I got bored. I wasn't being stimulated, and the public school system wasn't able to recognize that what was happening with me had nothing to do with developmental inabilities or disabilities, but it had to do with a young man who merely was bored and was not being stimulated. Unfortunately, resulting in me going through what is now known as the school to prison pipeline, ending up in a juvenile detention facility and subsequently spending a few years as a young man incapacitated. But it was during that time that I rediscovered my love for learning, and I began to ask the question, how does a young man who just loves to read and loves to write and who loves math and science, how does he end up in a prison cell? And it was then that I began my journey into criminal justice, and I began to find that I was not alone, that this wasn't an exclusive purview for me, but there were many young men like me, many black men who found themselves in this situation, not because they were bad people, but simply because the system wasn't prepared to deal with their growth. And so as a result, I find myself studying a system that begins with police accountability, or what I say, inaccountability, depending on how you look at it. But I think that the police is the door to the criminal justice system. And I think it begins with how the behaviors of certain men are criminalized as opposed to others. Young black men are seen as violent. Young black men are seen as predatory, as bad. This is how I was defined, that I was incorrigible, that I was disruptive, that I was bad, and these are behaviors that could not be accepted in the classroom, so instead I was put in detention, then eventually expelled from school. And then the rest is history. But what I will say is my understanding of now police accountability starts with the fact that behaviors that otherwise should only result in a young man going to the principal's office and possibly having a conference with his parents instead are criminalized. So instead of individuals actually having to sit down, they're actually being handcuffed and they're actually being taken away in a squad car for what is nothing more than school-based behaviors. These school-based behaviors ultimately result in individuals having a criminal record, being placed on what's called a rap sheet. Each time an individual has an encounter with the system, they produce what's called a record of arrest and prosecution. These records are then sent to a central repository, and that repository is where the same records of arrest and prosecution are held. And so when companies do background checks, individuals who merely been arrested, even if that arrest was determined to be an illegal arrest, even if the individual was let go hours later, even if the individual never saw a judge, because they've been arrested, that information is held in places where that information could be used by background companies who then can use that to deny individuals employment, deny them access to housing, deny them access to a whole range of opportunities, and therefore limit their ability to be able to excel. This is simply by the arrest. If the individual who is captured by law enforcement actually finds themselves going further into the system, then the collateral consequences of an arrest and a conviction can have lifetime implications. So individuals not only have to serve time, if that is what the judgment of the court is, but after serving time, then they're denied licenses to practice law, to practice medicine. Individuals are denied financial aid. Individuals are denied access to live in federally subsidized housing. Individuals are denied so many things that individuals find necessary in order for them to be accomplished in life. And this all begins when they are encountered by police, when they are encountered by a system that predetermines their guilt before they ever even commit an act, simply because their skin is too dark and because they live in urban areas and because they decide to take a stroll at night. But the police accountability issue is something that you now know after the George Floyd killing has now become a global phenomenon. It's a discussion now that we can no longer deny. It's something that really speaks to the fact that our police need to be held accountable for their actions. And a lot of people misinterpret this. They believe that we're saying we don't want police. This is not what people are saying. Of course, everyone knows that police play a necessary role. Of course, we know that we want our community safe. What we don't want is our community to be over-policed. What we don't want is racial profiling. What we don't want is police behaving in our communities as if they're an occupying force. But let me tell you what we do want. What we do want is safety in our communities. What we do want, police who come into our communities and treat us with courtesy and respect. What we do want is a police force that understands that each community has its own unique dynamics and that it patrols our communities equally across the board. What we want is fairness. What we want is decency. What we want is to be treated with dignity and respect. And I don't think that these are unreasonable requests. I think that the community wants to have a relationship, but the community also wants a role in that relationship. The community wants its voice to be heard. The community wants the right to determine how it wants to be policed. And so when we talk about police accountability, we're talking about a balance of power. We're talking about police interacting with communities in a way that are mutually respectful. And we want them to do so that they can restore respect and restore confidence and restore accountability in what happens in our communities. When we talk about police reform, what we're actually talking about is what takes place on our streets on a daily basis, how our community members are approached, how our communities are spoken to and interacted with. What we're talking about when we talk about police accountability, we're talking about police whose behaviors are evaluated and assessed over time. If there's an officer who has been engaging in increasingly more aggressive policing over time, that there's an intervention that takes place. We're talking about police officers whose behaviors are regulated and whose behaviors are defined by the communities who have made determinations on how those communities should be policed. When we talk about police accountability, and I want this to be clear, what we're talking about is, number one, partnering with the community. We're talking about police who are interested in community engagement and not necessarily community enforcement. And while we realize there are times when enforcement is necessary, we don't think that enforcement per se should be the rule of thumb. We believe that police officers should come into our community with the intent to get to know the community, to understand the community, to engage with the community, to respond to the community, and to come in understanding that public safety is a shared responsibility, that all members of the community should be at the table. All members of the community should have a role, should make a contribution to ensure that our communities are safe, that our communities are thriving, that our communities are prosperous, and that our communities are places where our children can go to and from school without being harassed, without being exposed to drugs, that our elderly can enjoy their golden years without being under siege, where people can feel safe on all corners of our community. So when we talk about police accountability, this is not exclusively about the police, but it's about policing. And policing, in order for it to contribute to public safety, involves the contribution of all members of our community. In my new role as President and Chief Executive Officer of the People's Police Academy, I'm charged with the responsibility of bringing all facets of the community together to co-create public safety. And so we've created a public safety council that's comprised of people from the NYPD, from the Department of Probation, from the Department of Education, from the Department of Health, from the New York City Housing Authority, all the way up to the U.S. Department of Justice. We also have community members. We have faith leaders. We have youth leaders. We have non-traditional leaders, people who run street organizations who you otherwise might consider gang leaders, who too have a voice in the community because they're influencers. Everyone needs to be at the table. So in this role, I'm responsible for ensuring that not only everyone's voice is heard, but they actually make a contribution to the creation of co-safety. And the co-production of public safety really requires individuals who have given a lot of thought to problem solving. The People's Police Academy is a problem-solving institution that brings together individuals for 3 days of intense training to produce community-based public safety agendas that address the very specific concerns that each community has. And while no two communities are the same, we find that in some communities they might want to focus on the school system, others might want to discuss issues around the elderly, others might want to discuss creating pathways for young people to go to and about. We might find individuals who are interested in turning eyesores in the community into community gardens because they feel that beautifying the community might contribute to the way people see the community, the way they're seen by others outside the community. So depending on what the community wants, they have an opportunity to co-create public safety. This is what this People's Police Academy is all about. But more so, it's about empowerment. It's about people having a stake in it, because when people have a stake in their own prosperity and in their own public safety, they're more willing to protect it. They're more willing to do what is necessary to preserve that which they've been a part of creating. So this is what the people are asking for with police accountability. They're not saying we want to remove the police from the equation. They want to say that other people need to be a part of the equation, because the role of law enforcement is to enforce the law, but the role of the entire community is to create public safety. And those are two different things altogether. But when we bring them all together, what we have is a comprehensive and a holistic approach to public safety. This is what we're seeking. This is what the community wants. The community has spoken, and it has made it loud and clear that they would like to see a day when the community actually can be responsive and not reactive. Because right now, emotions are running high. People are very passionate. People are very unsatisfied about the unjust situations that are happening. We even know that the police themselves have dissatisfaction because they too are experiencing the trauma of their own work. And when individuals are exposed to trauma, it results in alcoholism, it results in suicide rates going up, it results in people being much more aggressive, and many times not even realizing that the source of this behavior actually comes from the trauma that they endure from doing the job. That also needs to be addressed. And so while we are addressing community issues and we're addressing the trauma of the community, we also need to be addressing police trauma. We need to understand that law enforcement is in a very precarious situation and that their job is very difficult, and that the things they do puts them in harm's way. And so over time, they become callous. Over time, they become very traumatized. Over time, they become very susceptible to the very smallest thing that can tick them off. And this is understandable because they're human beings as well. But what we also understand that unless we address these issues head on, and unless we recognize that historical trauma and accumulative trauma only results in more trauma. And so we're looking for intervention. So some of the solutions we want is more mental health services, not only for community members, but also for police officers. What we want is individuals having access to resources so that they can see that there's actually a road to success and prosperity. Because when people are limited and restricted in their ability to grow and thrive, they tend to do things that put them in harm's way. And so what we're saying, we have to resource the community. We have to build community infrastructure. We have to broaden the capacity. We have to give people ways out. We have to give people inroads into the career market. We have to create more jobs. We have to improve the conditions in the school. We have to increase the quality of health care. When we do these things, then we see prosperity on the rise, and we begin to see communities become more involved, more invested in what it is that they have helped to create. And as a result, we begin to see crime go down. We begin to see the quality of life go up. We begin to see people's hopes restored. We begin to see people behaving in positive ways. We begin to see them engaging in constructive endeavors. We begin to see an increase in participation in voting. We begin to see people who really care about each other, treating each other with respect and with dignity and pride. And we begin to see success in everything we do. And so we ask you to join us as we build the People's Police Academy at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, because we feel that public safety is not only a shared responsibility, but it's also something that each of us should express in our accountability to what we contribute to the quality of life here in New York State. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to pass it along to New York State Senator Brian A. Benjamin.
Good afternoon. I'm Senator Brian Benjamin, and I'm honored to be a participant in this year's NAACP New York State Convention. I want to thank Dr. Hazel Dukes, who is like a mother to me, who has helped to mentor me for so many years right here in the village of Harlem, and with whom I wouldn't be senator today. So I want to thank her for inviting me to participate. I want to thank you all for listening. Today the conversation, this panel is about continuing reform of the criminal justice system. To me, I want to start with why I even think the criminal justice system needs to be reformed. I was elected in 2017, May of 2017, and I ran on two things. One was reducing mass incarceration, and the second was on helping to increase the skills and workforce and opportunities for minority and women-owned businesses in my district. And one of the things that I thought was so important as I talked about reducing mass incarceration was to focus more on how do we reduce those who are being criminalized who aren't a threat to public safety. Sometimes when we talk about criminal justice reform, there are those who say you want to let criminals out on the street, and that is far from the truth. Many of us who want to reduce mass incarceration, what we really want is to stop having people who are incarcerated and they are not risk to public safety, and there is too many people who are caught in a system where they shouldn't have been there in the first place because they weren't really threats to public safety enough so that they needed to be incarcerated. And so there's a couple things that I think are important to mention. As we started this process when the Democrats took control of the Senate in 2019, we started to try to chip away at some of the fundamental blocks that have been keeping too many of our people incarcerated for way too long. We looked to end cash bail. There were too many cases. Many of us know the case of Cleve Browder, where you have people of color, particularly black and brown folks, who are literally waiting a year or two or three in Rikers Island for their day in court, and in the process being incarcerated before they were even convicted of a crime. Completely unacceptable. We did away with that. We also implemented speedy trials so that people wouldn't be sitting a year or two or three in Rikers waiting for their day in court. They'd get their day in court in 90 to 180 days, and they can move on with their lives. Also, we look to do discovery reform, where basically prosecutors could not utilize evidence in a way that was discriminatory, keeping evidence from defense attorneys and defendants so they can decide what's in their best interest and what the state has against them. All things that are just not fair. We did away with a lot of those things in 2019. We came back and also said, why are we incarcerating people for small marijuana offenses? I mean, you're almost effectively criminalizing addiction in a lot of cases. And a number of people who are incarcerated because they used marijuana, or they used heroin, or they used crack cocaine. Why are we criminalizing people who, in a lot of cases, have an addiction that needs to be helped? And we need to look at mental health as a solution, not incarceration. So we've started going down that road, and with decriminalizing 2 ounces of marijuana, we got more work to do on that front. We started to make some of those changes. As many of us know earlier this year, and some of us have been dealing with this for years, but earlier this year, with George Floyd's murder just really unleashed across the board. Many folks joined in on the conversation of, wait a minute, Black Lives Matter. Those of us who are Black have known that our lives matter for a long time. It's just that we needed something like 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a knee on someone's neck for the broader society to recognize that. And you know, we came back and passed a number of important reforms, one of which is my bill, which was a bill to take the chokehold, the chokehold that killed Derek Garner, from Daniel Pantaleo, and quite frankly, the same sort of restriction of the airflow that killed George Floyd, and say, if a police officer implements a chokehold, they will face automatic time in prison. We passed that bill. We passed a couple other bills. We also made it so that police officers who have disciplinary records that have been kept secret for so long, was the repeal 58 bill, so long, these records have been kept away from the public. We basically said, if you got a you have a record as a police officer, the public needs to see it. We want transparency and accountability. We passed that bill. And we passed a couple of other important bills that helped to make the public feel safe, that we can push back on the police for over-policing. That does not mean we don't need neighborhood policing. We don't need over-policing. We don't need policing that is harmful to Black and brown communities. We need policing that is fair, that is about protecting the people and serving the people, not intimidating the people and this so-called law and order fake crap that we see way too often coming out of our politics. We need to get away from that. And so we passed some bills to help make that happen. You know, as I look forward, you know, we've got a couple things that we still haven't done. You know, COVID has happened, and we still have some people in jail who shouldn't have been in the first place and who now are in a health risk. And I introduced a bill called Less is More that would basically say, if you have been incarcerated for a technical parole violation, which quite frankly is a violation that is not a crime, it is because you're out on parole, these technical things can land you back in jail. We need to do away with that. If there are people who are out on parole and they might have missed curfew, or they might have dirty urine, or things that just in and of themselves aren't crimes, we should find other mechanisms to try to help keep them on their path to recovery, help keep them moving forward in society. That's the kind of world we want to live in, a world where people have made mistakes and they paid for the mistakes and they're rehabilitated. We're not trying to trip them up to keep this criminal industrial complex going on the back of Black and brown lives. We can't do it anymore.
Now, our panelists are going live to answer some of your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Pryor. This was an excellent workshop. And what I'd like to do is turn it over to you and Senator Benjamin so that we can continue this very important discussion. Dr. Pryor?
Sure. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this year's NAACP convention. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Dr. Pryor, what we're going to do is people have put in the chat some questions for you and Senator Benjamin. So I'm going to let you lead the way in that discussion, sir.
Okay, fine. Let me see if I can go to the chat and pull up these questions. Let's see.
If you have an issue, let me know and I'll help you out.
I see a question here. It says the prison system was supposed to be for reforming criminals. The jail people of color are not being educated on the root cause of them being in the system. Systemic racism, constant oppression, and the privatization of the prison should be part of a mental health program. We need these things in order to aid.
I think Dr. Pryor is frozen a little bit. Senator Benjamin, are you there? Are you back, Dr. Pryor?
I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna see if I can get my face back on here. And okay, I'm back. Okay, so there's a question, someone was asking a question in regards to whether or not the criminal punishment system, as we refer to it as, is a system about oppression, is a system that predetermines the incarceration of certain populations. And the answer to that is yes. That is the case that many of us who've been studying this system for years recognize that the current criminal justice system really is nothing more than 21st century chattel slavery. And they've used the legal system as a mechanism to give legitimacy to incarcerating a certain populations of people. And this is not an allegation anymore. This is not urban myth. This has been researched and it is fact-based. And we know that the system is racist through and through. We know that racial profiling is real. We know that the presumption of guilt for Black people is something that is embedded in the policies in most, if not all, of the different facets of the criminal justice system. And it's time for us to dismantle this system. It's time for us to create a system that is fair and equitable. So that is my response to that question. Thank you for the question.
Okay, and I know that you're going, you're freezing a little bit, so I'm going to help out and answer some of the questions. Senator Benjamin, you're up next, sir. So, you know, for especially for people that are outside of the city, we had a real challenge making sure that our senators were on board with all of the bills for the criminal justice. But now, as you know, after the executive order, and it's now up to the municipalities, it's still a challenge to get now the new, it's been passed down to the county legislators and the county executives. What do you recommend for us to do to continue the advocacy that was able to have all of the state Senate and Assembly pass all of those bills?
Well, first of all, thank you, Tracy. I want to thank the NAACP for constantly being on the front lines for our community. And I see a number of friends on this, and I want to thank you for your leadership. I firmly believe that we have to force all municipalities to have a process where we talk about policing from its root. I think that we have to start from square one, take out a blank sheet of paper, and basically say, what do we want police to do and what do we not want police to do? You know, we know in communities of color, particularly Black communities, that mental health is a real issue. Far too often, the criminal justice system, is used as a place for mental health, and that's not right. Folks who need mental health services need to get that help, and we should not have the police as the mechanism to do with that. And so I think we need to really look at every single thing we have police do, and we need to say this should stay and this should go, and the things that go, where do they go, and how is that helping our public safety generally, but more importantly, how are we uplifting communities? You know, there's sometimes when, you know, people are crying out for help, and it's not that they need to be arrested. They might need a job. They might need, in some cases, just someone to talk to. They might need a range of things that are not police. And I think we have become way too comfortable using police as a catch-all for every single issue. And I think what has to happen is the community, particularly the NAACP and others, needs to force the hand of our mayors, quite frankly. New York City, the most progressive city in the world, according to the people who say they're progressive, yet we're having a hard time with them driving this conversation about what police should look like. We should be reimagining police in New York City and how that works. If not here, where? And so for me, I think that's what we should all be doing, is making sure that our top elected officials are continuing to have this conversation, particularly in this moment of racial sort of awareness, right? Everyone believes Black Lives Matter now. The question is, what does that mean? You know, what are we getting as a people out of it besides street signs, right? So that would be my thought, and I want to support some of Dr. Pryor's points. I mean, you know, we have to call out the system for what it is, but we have to reimagine it, and we have to talk about what a new system should look like at the same time.
Thank you very much, Senator. Dr. Pryor, what strategies do you suggest for teachers and parents to use as we go forward with ensuring that we are not only over-policing in our streets, but we don't want to over-police and over-discipline in our school system?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that question. We're doing that work now involving parents and students in restructuring our public school experience. And I think that it first begins with self-identity. We have to, you know, teach our young people, young Black men and women, that they are descendants of royalty. We have to teach them that they are precious. We have to teach them that they are important, that they are valuable, because we have to offset the images and the messages that have been depicted about our children over centuries, teaching them that they're less than and they're not as good as and they're not worthy. I think that once they begin to understand their self-worth and their self-value, then they'll begin to express themselves in a way that affirms who they are. And that they, you know, are intelligent and that they are bright and that they are creative. And I think that it begins there. The same thing has to happen in the home. I think that our parents, they also need to understand how valuable they are and how impressionable they are to their children. And they have to be very careful about the images that they portray around their homes and the things that they allow their children to listen to. The conversations that they have need to be affirmative conversations. They need to be positive. They need to be productive. And these things, they kind of reinforce what it is that we are attempting to create here. We're attempting to create a world that we ourselves are in control of. The word community control is something that's been used for a long time, but I think a lot of people don't understand what that really means. But let me just give it to you in simple terms. It means that every member of the community has a responsibility, has a role, has a contribution to make in order for our communities to be whole. So it begins with the parents, it continues in the school, and then all the institutions that impact on our schools and our communities, they also need to be brought in the fold. There needs to be an alignment of thought. They need to understand that self-preservation is something that is real, but it requires collective work and responsibility. It requires that all of us contribute, you know, to this work. So we need to roll up our sleeves and we need to get this work started.
Thank you. That's powerful. Senator Benjamin, back to you. So, you know, we have 500 municipalities in the state of New York that have to reimagine policing. Some are doing the effort better than others. Some are just packaging the same old policies and procedures that they have, and they are rolling it out for community input and not doing the hard work by asking the questions. So, you know, I think we need some help to make sure that there are strategies that all of the branches can use throughout the state of New York to get the right people to the table and to ensure that they are actually doing the work. Do you have any advice for us?
Yeah, I think actually you're giving me advice, right? I think what you're really saying is that it would be helpful if there was sort of like a framework or some kind of a format that is a process that can be used across the board. I mean, when the governor issued the executive order, and by the way, Dr. Hazel Dukes, who you all know and love, was very instrumental and aggressive in getting him to that point, along with Reverend Sharpton and others. But I think you're raising a very important point, which is, should we, I mean, I think part of the thought is every municipality is different. You don't want to over manage people because then they push back. And, you know, obviously what works for New York City might not work for Pisco, might not work for Albany, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think I want to sort of think about that a little bit and maybe come back to you, because I think I talked to the governor's office and others about that. Should we have sort of like, well, this is sort of like the guidelines. This is sort of like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 process. That's a good question. You know, in my gut, I think so, but I think we should talk about it more, because, you know, municipalities are different. New York City is a very different city than other places, right? I think the real question is, we need champions in each city who take this seriously and will drive the process. That's clear. The question is, what should happen beyond that? I want to think about that a little bit.
Okay, that's great, because the guidance did come out. And the steps are there, but some are following it and some don't. And what they're saying is it's only guidance. So, right?
Yeah.
So it's, they're choosing not to move forward. So Dr. Pryor, to you as well, because we know that you've been on the front line before. When you have government officials that want to just keep it status quo, and because they are, quite frankly, beholden to the PBA union money, what is it that we can do to ensure that we are, they are listening to their constituency as opposed to following that check, Dr. Pryor?
Well, I'm going to give you the honest answer. If in fact they are not representing the needs and the desires of those who put them in office, then we need to get them out of office. I don't hold any punches when it comes to accountability for everyone, and particularly elected officials who are not only writing laws, but they're voting on the laws, and those laws have to represent what the true needs of the community are. Far too often, we have elected officials who start off right. They start off with the best intentions, and then they get in the office, and then they just kind of become a part of business as usual. I think that we really need to maintain very close relationships with our elected officials. We need to monitor their activities. We need to monitor their votes, see what they're voting on, what issues that they stand up for, what their principles are, what their values are, and make sure that they're always in alignment with the wishes of the people. And whenever that's not the case, quite simply, we need to get them out of office. I think we need to encourage our young people to really get involved in the process, because that's the only way that we're going to change the way things are. The only way we're going to be able to put forth a productive and a progressive agenda is when we get young people who come in with new energy, with new ideas, with creativity, with vision, with passion, but those who are also courageous and brave, and they're willing to step out, and they're willing to take risks, because in order for us to do something different, we have to take risks. I know there was Albert Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is a person who does the same thing over and over again, and yet they expect a different outcome. And we've been doing the same thing over and over again, and we've been getting dismal results. I think it's time for us to do something different, and it starts with those who are in power to shape the laws that we have to abide by, and those are elected officials. Again, any elected official who is not representing the true desires and needs of the people should simply be taken out of office, and I would be the first to lead the charge on that.
Well, thank you very much.
Can I comment on that real quick?
Thank you, Dr. Pryor. I'm going to go back to you, Senator Benjamin, to actually have the last word, sir. Okay?
Yeah, I want to talk about that, because I actually agree with a lot of what Dr. Pryor said up to a point. There are certain communities that we all have to be honest about, that the constituents there, they don't want criminal justice reform. They don't want us to change a single thing. So the question becomes, you have situations with in some districts, the reason why they're not doing anything about it is because they don't want to do it. And so how do we deal with that? And I think that's why I come back to your question before. Maybe we made a mistake by not having force in this, because guidance means, you can choose to or cannot choose to. And I think that one thing that I know is always the case, whenever the community is truly mobilized around an issue, the politicians respond. And as an elected official, the issue happens when the community is not mobilized, and the politician might know what they should do, what's the right thing for the community, but then does something different. That's one thing. But the second problem, which is what I think is part of this, is there are a number of communities that just feel like they've had enough. They want to say Black Lives Matter. They want everyone to, maybe march a little bit, but they don't want to change much, and they want to go home. How do we address that? And I think the way we deal with that, there has to be more force in the matter, and I think we should revisit that as it relates to reimagining policing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We could talk to you and Dr. Pryor for the rest of the afternoon, but I think what we have to do is provide some sort of mechanism for us to continue that dialogue, because we are going to need some help in the state of New York, because all of the municipalities have until April 1st, but they're just trying to run the clock. So I think with you, Senator Benjamin, and the elected officials that we know that we can count on, and with Dr. Pryor helping us chart the way, we can get there. So thank you both very much for this discussion.
Thank you.